You probably heard someone say the Indo-Pacific is the new epicenter of the world. But do you know why? Let's get into it. First, let me outline the geostrategic constellations of this region after World War II. Then let's examine how and where the geopolitical competition between China and the United States is being played out today, and what strategic consequences this conflict has for the vast majority of Asian states that do not want to take sides. Before we dive into these geopolitical questions, a quick disclaimer about the term Indo-Pacific. Names for geographic regions are human-made, meaning they always have historical or cultural origin, as well as a political, often geopolitical purpose. The two parts of the term Indo-Pacific have European origins. Indos is a Greek word for the Sindhu River in present-day Pakistan and the surrounding regions, which the Persians actually called Hindustan. During European colonizations, the term India was then broadly applied to the British colonial empire in South Asia, the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, and the French colony in Indochina, what is the Mekong River region. The connecting body of water was accordingly named the Indian Ocean. Mar Pacifico, meaning the peaceful ocean, was termed by the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan when he was sailing around the globe. And even the term Asia does not exist in any of the languages spoken across this vast region. It originates from Greek and originally referred to the Aegean coast of what is now called Turkey. Accordingly, the Romans named their province in Anatolia Asia Minor, and much later the Europeans applied that name to the vast region between Turkey and Japan. So there never was an indigenous name for the vast region between the two oceans, only European designations that have shifted over the centuries in response to geopolitical dynamics. But what was that geopolitical purpose behind these names? Regional designations include certain powers, legitimizing their influence, while excluding others, effectively delegitimizing them as outsiders. After World War II, the term Asia became problematic because it excluded the United States. In response, the term Asia-Pacific was introduced, incorporating the United States and Australia while excluding the Soviet Union. Russia, in turn, asserts its influence in the region through the term Eurasia, which includes Europe but excludes the United States. However, the Asia-Pacific designation not only excludes Russia but also India. Japan was about the first to recognize that US power alone would no longer be sufficient to counterbalance China. To offset the giant that is China, one needs another giant, India, on one side. This led to the creation of the term Indo-Pacific, which excludes Russia but includes India. The term Indo-Pacific was quickly adopted by the Quad, or short for Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a strategic partnership between Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. Unsurprisingly, Beijing rejects the term Indo-Pacific and prefers to speak of Asia, or broader, the Global South, both terms that exclude the United States. However, even neutral powers which wish to avoid being drawn into the power struggle between China and the US are uneasy with the term Indo-Pacific. Interestingly, it is hard to understand why Europeans have adopted it, given that Indo-Pacific excludes Europe. But no matter what one calls the region, there is always a geopolitical agenda behind it, and there is no such thing as a neutral term. So about the geostrategic constellations. Since the end of World War II, the fundamental strategic constellation of the region has been determined by the relations between the Big Four, the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, China, and India. At the height of the Cold War, the antagonism between the US and the USSR shaped a bipolar world order. The bloodiest proxy wars between the blocs were fought in the Indo-Pacific, in Korea, later Vietnam, and even later in Afghanistan. The US established its hub and spokes alliance system with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines, the effects of which can be still felt today. Mao Zedong's China looked to the Soviet Union as a great role model, while India under Jawaharlal Nehru, despite its ideological proximity to socialism, founded the non-aligned movement together with Indonesia. This geopolitical constellation began to break up toward the end of the 1960s. Beijing and Moscow were engaged in a border war, and Henry Kissinger recognized the opportunity for a strategic realignment. By the time then President Richard Nixon traveled to China, the break between China and the Soviet Union was complete. New Delhi, on the other hand, reacted to the American support to Pakistan in the Bangladeshi War of Independence with indignance. During the détente phase of the Cold War, India drew closer to the Soviet Union, while China sought proximity to the US. After the end of the Cold War, the United States dominated the unipolar world order. Russia, China, and India initially cooperated with the US. With the exceptions of the conflicts on the Korean Peninsula and in South Asia, the old Cold War blocs dissolved in favor of new communities. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar joined the ASEAN community. This was followed by the heyday of globalization and global governance. Despite the promises of the liberal world order, so prosperity through economic integration and multilateral cooperation to tackle global challenges, India, Pakistan, and North Korea acquired nuclear weapons. When Xi Jinping took office in 2013, China changed its strategic posture. Beijing feels encircled by the US and its allies. The possibility of a blockade of its supply lines through the Strait of Malacca is particularly worrying for China. To counter that risk, China is trying to break through to the Silk Road Initiative. The routes through Myanmar and Pakistan are intended to give Beijing access to the energy reserves of the Middle East and the European market. In the East, China is pursuing a different strategy. By militarizing the South China Sea, it is trying to deny potential adversaries access to the areas it considers to be its sphere of influence. China is also trying to break through the US island chains in order to advance into the strategic depth of the Western Pacific. The race with Washington for the favor of Pacific islands is part of this geopolitical game. While China sees these measures as defensive, Japan, Taiwan, and the maritime ASEAN states perceive them as aggressive expansion. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and especially since the start of the war of aggression against the whole of Ukraine in 2022, the relationship between Russia and the West has once again become antagonistic. In today's constellation, the borderless partners, China and Russia, face off against the US. Unlike during the Cold War, Russia is now China's junior partner. In contrast to the Soviet Union, China is now closely intertwined economically with the rest of the world and has strong interests in an open trade order. Today, as then, India seeks to maximize its room for maneuver by avoiding firm alliances. However, the border conflicts in the Himalayas have alienated India. Delhi feels threatened by Beijing and is increasingly seeking proximity to Washington and its Quad partners, Japan and Australia. With a few exceptions, the majority of the smaller and medium-sized powers in the region are trying to avoid taking sides. Regulatory bipolarity, ideological polarization, such as democracy versus autocracy, technological division, a trade bloc formation are rejected due to the high opportunity costs. The pressing question being discussed in the capitals is now How sustainable are these strategies of balancing? Could disruptive events or structural constraints ultimately force states to choose sides against their interests? The most dramatic scenario that would put pressure on these swing states is to choose sides would be direct war between the superpowers. One conceivable trigger would be an American-Chinese conflict over Taiwan that quickly escalates on the Korean Peninsula into the South China Sea and the Straits of Malacca. Even if a nuclear escalation could be prevented, the most important global supply chains would suddenly be interrupted. Active hostilities or alliance commitments would force the US allies Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines into this war. This is one of the reasons they are focusing on deepening their military alliance with the United States. Washington is also encouraging its allies to work more closely together in trilateral formats. Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia are also under pressure to choose sides, while Vietnam and Indonesia could be caught in the middle. India would probably try to stay out of such a conflict, but could be drawn into it through hostilities in the Indian Ocean. Europe would also come under pressure to support its allies. A conflict in East Asia, hence, has the potential to escalate into a world war. Clashes in the East and South China Seas and provocations regarding Taiwan increase the risk of an accident that could trigger a spiral of escalation. However, neither side currently has a strategic interest in a military confrontation. China must focus its resources on fighting the domestic economic crisis, which is threatening its legitimacy. An escalating conflict that focuses Washington's attention and resources on China is not in Beijing's interest. Beijing is therefore following Russia's rapprochement with North Korea with concern. Russia is also trying to shift the US focus from itself to other regions of the world. The United States is still searching for its new role in the world. While Donald Trump has won the presidential elections, it is still unclear whether primicists defending American hegemony, prioritizers focusing on China, or isolationists, America first, or retrenchment into the Western Hemisphere, will have the stronger sway in the next administration. However, there's been long a consensus across party lines that competition with China must be fierce. War games show that the military conflict with China is hardly winnable. Both countries are preparing for military confrontation, but the so-called balance of terror could ultimately prevent a war between the superpowers. The incoming Trump administration will have to quickly realize that even the resources of a superpower in a world with three geopolitical hotspots, Europe, Middle East, and East Asia, are limited. To counteract an overextension of American power, the Biden administration has opted to manage the strategic rivalry with China. It remains to be seen what approach the Trump administration will take. Will Trump grant the China hawks in his administration full reign, or will the dealmaker-in-chief pursue a follow-up agreement to the 2020 US-China Phase 1 trade agreement? Geoeconomic disruptions. The Sino-American hegemonic conflict is therefore primarily being played out in the fields of economics and technology. The US small yard, high fences strategy is aimed at delaying China's rise to become the world's technological leader. While the Chip 4 alliance has committed Taiwan, South Korea, and the Netherlands to decoupling themselves from China. In return, China is developing its own semiconductor and AI technologies. This technological bifurcation will impose high opportunity costs on third countries. If the de-dollarization of the BRICS countries is successful, a similar development threatens to come about in the financial sector. Protectionist measures by OECD countries are increasingly linking market access to political conditions. Highly indebted developing countries are confronted with geopolitical conditions when they need rescue packages. In response to the pandemic-related disruptions, industrialized countries are beginning to make their supply chains more resilient. But investments now also depend on whether a location is considered geopolitically reliable, what you call friendshoring. In the end, the result of this development could be trading blocs that seal themselves off from one another. Similar dependencies exist in the area of military technology. Countries that have invested in certain systems are dependent on compatible supplies, spare parts, and ammunition for decades to come. Taken all together, these structural constraints can force small and medium-sized states in the Indo-Pacific to choose sides. To counteract that risk, most states in the region, with a few exceptions, are pushing complex hedging and balancing strategies. In the northeast, democratic Mongolia, wedged between the autocratic superpowers of China and Russia, relies on a third-party foreign policy to reduce one-sided dependencies and expand its scope for action. In Southeast Asia, the maritime neighbors of the South China Sea are pushing a different strategy to China's mainland neighbors. The Philippines, in particular, have opted for a robust defense of their territorial integrity against China's advances under the protection of the United States. Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei also insist on territorial claims, but pursue a policy of equilibrium for economic and ideological reasons. Malaysia is enacting a policy of active neutrality and is open to doing business with all sides. The aim is to recommend itself to the West as a geopolitical reliable location for semiconductor industries, and at the same time to welcome Chinese companies that are relocating their production abroad. On the one hand, China criticizes the West for its role in the Gaza war, for instance, and on the other, it's deepening its defense relations with Australia and conducting maneuvers with the United States. Like Thailand, Malaysia is seeking membership both in the Western-oriented OECD club and the anti-Western BRICS format, something also being discussed in Jakarta. Singapore is going even further. While it hosts US naval units and could close the Strait of Malacca in an event of war, it also rivals Hong Kong as China's gateway to the world. As a major hub, Singapore supports open sea and trade routes and a rule-based order to maintain the foundations of its prosperity and security. On the mainland, Laos and Cambodia have tied their fate closely to a partnership with China. The military junta in Myanmar, severely restricted to its international isolation, has pretty few options other than to cooperate with China and Russia. Thailand, an important non-NATO ally, has increasingly sought cooperation with Beijing under the international ostracized military government. Today, Bangkok is once again relying on its bamboo politics. For example, the smooth swaying in the geopolitical storms that enable it to maneuver relatively unscathed through the colonial era, World War II, and the Indochina Wars. In South China, the conflict between India and Pakistan shaped the power structure for a long time. Today, the antagonism between New Delhi and Beijing, even more than the Sino-American competition, shapes regional dynamics. Pakistan has closely linked its economic and political development to the multi-billion-dollar China-Pakistan economic corridor. However, China's refusal to save Pakistan from the threat of national bankruptcy at an acceptable price has raised doubts in Islamabad as to whether a pro-China balancing act may have tipped too far in Beijing's direction. Nepal, wedged between India and China, is trying to resist the desires of its large neighbors, but is only able to do so to a limited extent due to its internal political chaos. Sri Lanka, also politically unstable, has become a key target for Chinese expansion in the Indian Ocean. The handover of the port of Hambantota as part of a Chinese bailout has lent new credibility to the narrative of Chinese debt trap diplomacy in the region. The Maldives are also being integrated into China's string of pearls in the Indian Ocean as maritime supply bases. But here too, domestic political turbulence is thwarting Beijing's plans. Bangladesh has long been under the influence of India. After the fall of the Iron Lady Sheikh Hasina, Dhaka is also likely to increasingly seek more room for maneuver between the colossi. Unlike their Southeast Asian neighbors, the smaller South Asian neighbors are often unable to produce dependencies through flexible shuttling due to internal political instability. India, frustrated by the political instability of its neighborhood, is pursuing a multi-alignment strategy with powers outside the region aimed at benefiting from geopolitical competition and maximizing its own room for maneuver. Whether these strategies of balancing will succeed in the long term or ultimately fail due to external events and structural constraints, that is the crucial question in the Indo-Pacific.